Поехали. Okay. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Music and the Soviet Space Project presentation in honor of the 60th anniversary of the first Cosmonautics Day in the USSR. Today, presentation co-hosts are Deputy Director at the Politaev Institute for Theoretical and Historical Studies in the Humanities, Dr. Boris Stepanov, and Senior Research Fellow at the Politaev Institute for Theoretical and Historical Studies in the Humanities, Dr. Alexandra Kolesnik. And I invite our presenter, Assistant Professor of Musicology at the University of Miami, Dr. Gabrielle Cornish.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, everyone, for logging on, be it evening in Moscow or breakfast or lunchtime in the US. I'm really excited to talk about this on Cosmonautics Day to celebrate 60 years since Gagarin's flight. Special thanks to both Boris and Alexandra for all of their help putting this together. And we would not be here today were it not for the heroic work of Oksana Budka. So thank you so much, Oksana, for gathering this and organizing it and doing everything behind the scenes. So, and my thanks to Vyshka and then also to Igiti and the Faculty of Economic Sciences. So I am going to share my screen. All right, visible? Yes, okay. On the 12th of April, 1963, a special episode of the variety television show Goluboy Ogonyok aired on Soviet television. Celebrating Cosmonautics Day, the episode marked the 2-year anniversary of Yuri Gagarin's successful flight as the first man to orbit the Earth. Alongside others who had since made the journey into space, Gagarin sat at a decorated table in front of a studio audience, and of course, the many people watching at home. The cosmonauts smiled at each other and at audience members as they celebrated yet another aeronautic milestone, the coming launch of the first woman in space, Valentina Tereshkova. Tereshkova, or Chaika as she was nicknamed, was preparing for her flight aboard Vostok 6 that would take place on the 16th of June. And through television screens around the Soviet Union, the country prepared with her. In between musical performances, literary readings, and the presentation of gifts, the episode's host sat down with Tereshkova to ask her about her professional qualifications and personal life. Was she nervous to fly? Did she feel proud to be the first woman in space? Was her preparation difficult? Eventually, one of the hosts asked what she did to relax. I love to listen to music, Tereshkova responded, especially Tchaikovsky's violin concerto and his first piano concerto. And of course, good, happy songs. When pressed for examples of these good, happy songs, she offered to sing a few cosmic couplets, a parody of the popular song, The Textile Town, which she and the other cosmonauts had sung the year before at Andrian Nikolaev's launch.
Вообще лучше, конечно, прочитать.
Городок наш ничего, население таково, совсекретные ребята составляют большинство. Рыщет пресса по кустам, ищет пресса тут и там. Ах, куда ведет Гагарин космонавток по утрам?
Там есть еще другой куплет, я расскажу. Там есть такие слова: крутит Валя бегудит, и Валерка не грусти. Чует сердце, наша встреча на орбите впереди.
А там стыл. Ну, в общем, там есть куплет и про Андрея, но мы его оставим в покое.
Мы оставим в покое.
I can only imagine what those couplets about Andrei might have been. The altered lines of the textile town poked fun at their top secret status and Gagarin's sometimes libidinous personality, which had gained traction in the popular press. Though the men mostly refrained from singing, Tereshkova's pleasant voice garnered smiles from swaying audience members. They, too, could join in on the cosmonauts' fun. Nestled between the waning years of Stalinism and the burgeoning cultural reforms of the thaw, the space race fell at the crossroads of great change, potential, and consequence. Stalinism had been more than just a political regime. As a language, culture, and set of ethics, it had permeated every aspect of Soviet life, with repercussions that could be felt in both public and private spheres, the arts, and the daily maneuvers of ordinary citizens. Thus, when the leader succumbed to cerebral hemorrhage early in the morning on March 5th, 1963, he left behind a cultural, political, and social system that would outlive its namesake by many years. Out from the shadows of Stalinism, then, the Soviet Union stepped forward into an uncertain future. In doing so, they confronted a new set of questions as to what being Soviet might mean. The subsequent 2 decades would bear a series of dramatic cultural shifts at the individual, national, and international level. As Khrushchev's reforms sought to build a socialist version of modernity, one that allowed for greater personal, social, and artistic freedoms, the utopian ideologies that had grown dim under Stalin were revitalized through reform, internationalism, and progressivism. No longer quite so straightforward in its official ideological grounding, Soviet identity in the late 1950s and early 1960s embraced a slippery optimism about what the future could hold. Early triumphs such as the orbit of Sputnik 1 in 1957, Gagarin's groundbreaking flight in 1961, and Tereshkova's success as the first woman in space in 1963 epitomized many of these utopian underpinnings, as well as the complexities of the cultural Cold War. Space was the ultimate non-aligned sphere, an untouched territory ready for the planting of both real and ideological flags. At the same time, these successes were key in reimagining ideals of Soviet citizenship and national identity in the post-Stalin era. And so in my talk today, I want to use the space race as an inroad to examine how music, media, and sound helped to spread these emerging values across the Soviet Union. Looking at the popular press, radio broadcasts, and variety television performances, I explore how music was used to humanize the cosmonauts and promote a new personal ethics for the post-Stalin era, one that prized approachability and humility alongside heroism and bravery. And it's worth noting that for the sake of time today, I'm focusing on texted popular songs that directly addressed the space race in some way. But there were, of course, plenty of other examples of cosmic music. I'm thinking here of Misherin's ensemble of electro-musical instruments and the various synth genres that came out of sort of space age music. And I'm happy to talk about some of those in the Q&A afterwards as well. The divergent ways in which music was deployed alongside Gagarin and Tereshkova further reveal a complex politics of gender during the thaw. Gagarin, the conqueror, received marches extolling his great colonizing feats. Tereshkova, the homemaker, was celebrated with romances and tales of domesticity. Ultimately, by demonstrating the prevalence of new media and the power of participatory practices, such as those we just saw in this clip, this talk contributes to our understanding of the cultural Cold War as a lived and performed experience. The new Soviet man was by no means a single immutable concept of identity. Rather, it was an ideal that was constantly under negotiation and renegotiation in both public and state spheres. It was a forward-looking project with its roots in utopian thought. The image and commensurate values associated with the new Soviet man shifted over the country's lifespan. Throughout, however, it remained a guiding ethical principle around which various cultural, social, and national projects were curated. In its original Leninist guise, it was a largely theoretical construct, and this new Soviet man was a person of the future, a good, honest worker whose bravery, self-sacrifice, and strength embodied an idealized socialist collectivism. In the early years of Stalinism, however, these more abstract ideals were imposed onto particularly audacious workers and members of the proletariat. As male and female heroes of the factories, mines, and foundries were celebrated for their productivity, the new Soviet man became a person example in the broader project of kulturnist or culturedness, and the Stakhanovite is probably the most well-known embodiment of these values during the Stalinist era. A civilizing process primarily located in urban centers, Kulturnist represented a national initiative to normalize Soviet etiquette and ethics across a diverse, nascent country. These workers enabled ordinary Soviets to model their behavior after real comrades, not theoretical values. The post-Stalinist hero, however, needed to reflect the changed values of the thaw, spontaneous, genuine, and humble. In his not-so-secret speech of 1956, Khrushchev denounced his predecessor for his cult of personality, or личности. Marking a pivotal moment in the thaw, the leader argued for a return to the values of Marxist-Leninism and collectivity. As the process of de-Stalinization began to take hold, so too did this revised image of the new Soviet man, a new Soviet man who would embolden the collective without overtaking it in fame or glory. The new Soviet man of the thaw then spoke to some of the era's contradictions and discontinuities. He would need to be both exceptional and approachable, autonomous and collective. The space race proved an essential testing ground for these new ethical values. Space explorers were powerful cultural symbols. Gagarin's successful orbit represented a powerful Soviet victory in the Cold War, and he quickly became a celebrity both at home and abroad. With his good looks, boyish charm, and radiant smile, he was the perfect replacement hero figure for the post-Stalin age. As historian Andrew Jenks has noted, rather than assuming a paternal role like that which had been ascribed to Stalin, Gagarin acted as a son for the whole nation. Rather than rising above him, the cosmonaut hero lifted his brothers and sisters to his level. Gagarin was engaging, charismatic, modest, and supremely likable. He was a true hero for the Khrushchev age. His ability to both embolden and reflect the public was, of course, part of the point. The space program's mission was twofold, both to colonize the cosmos and to reinforce cultural values at home. To adoring fans, the so-called cosmonaut who couldn't stop smiling continued a lineage of heroic Soviet aviators, though one recalibrated to fit the values of the thaw. Significantly, however, Gagarin's new Soviet man would be broadcast in prime time and hence publicized in ways his aeronautic predecessors could not have been. His flight coincided with what historians Kristen Rothy and Christine Evans have highlighted as a sort of golden age of TV in the Soviet Union. The 1950s through 70s saw an increase in the infrastructure necessary to transmit television signals across a larger geographic area, not just to Moscow, but also throughout Russia and eventually the other Soviet republics. The era also coincided with the introduction of live broadcasting techniques. Largely due to the historic victories and important events that occurred at that time, the early 1960s stood out as a particularly exciting moment for central television. The medium was a potent means of promoting images of new model citizenship. And Evans has noted that Gagarin, with his youthful telegenic face, was the perfect person example to display to viewers. As one telling anecdote reveals, Gagarin consciously used television to cultivate an approachable persona. Upon his return to Moscow, one of his shoelaces came untied while he was being filmed walking across Red Square. As censors and editors later debated cutting the mistake, Gagarin chimed in to insist that it remained, as it cultivated an aura of sincerity and truthfulness. A far cry from the Stalinist years of cutting, pasting, and airbrushing photos and films, Gagarin suggested that heroes in the Khrushchev age could come from anywhere and be anyone, wardrobe malfunctions and all. A celebrity of the ordinary, to borrow Graham Turner's phrase, Gagarin had become an everyman of the people through various mass media. Amidst the complex cultural politics of the Cold War, however, it was not enough for the Soviets to send the first man into space. In order to promote its utopian ideals of equality, both at home and abroad, they would also need to launch the first woman cosmonaut. Thus, the successful flight of Valentina Tereshkova on the 16th of June in 1963 aboard Vostok 6 marked another victory in the space race. And indeed, it seems as though the global underpinnings of this mission were largely effective. The United States Congress began debating the relative merits of women astronauts at this time in response to Tereshkova. But of course, the United States would not send a woman into space until 1983 with Sally Ride. And just to give you an idea of just how sort of male-centric this organization was, they very famously sent Sally Ride into space for 6 days with no fewer than 100 tampons because they weren't sure how many would be necessary. So it was 20 years after the fact. Welcoming Tereshkova home after her flight, Khrushchev capitalized on this inequality between the Soviet Union and the United States in a speech he gave on Red Square. Her flight lasted longer than all the American astronauts together have spent in space. That's the weaker sex for you. The name of Valentina Vladimirovna will go down in world history. She has demonstrated once again that women raised under socialism walk alongside men in all the people's concerns, both in self-sacrificing labor and in heroic feats. Or at least that was the idea. Despite Khrushchev's political posturing, Tereshkova did not exactly walk alongside men in her post-flight career. While her male colleagues would appear in military uniform, Tereshkova was paraded about the country in domestic clothing, the simple, dark textiles of a modern Soviet housewife. Although she held the rank of junior lieutenant, the press referred to her as Ms. Tereshkova. And even though she had hoped to continue her military training after her successful flight, bureaucrats instead encouraged her to pursue a career of advocating for women in politics. Her wedding to the fellow cosmonaut Andrian Nikolaev in November that same year drew much attention from the popular press, as did the birth of their daughter in June 1964. Onlookers and fans celebrated Tereshkova's post-orbit life as a pop cultural phenomenon, and both popular and official discourses celebrated her particularly womanly qualities. The new Soviet man, it seems, was gender neutral in idea, but not practice, and a de facto new Soviet woman arose in parallel as a result of these incongruities. Images of Tereshkova as explorer, homemaker, and peacebringer would prove especially important as the space race became less about firsts, satellites, dogs, man, woman, and more about expanding and sustaining new horizons. Gagarin had conquered space, yes, but Tereshkova would need to settle it and make it a feasible home. If Gagarin was the proud son of the Soviet people, in many ways, Tereshkova was both their daughter and their mother. He was the head of the family, she then would be the homemaker. In many ways, the cultural depictions of the cosmonauts paralleled what Soviet women experienced at home in their daily lives. From the start, music, sound, and the space race were linked. For many, the cosmos was inherently musical, and its conquest took on symphonic proportions. Flights were described as solo performances and duets. Even the ballerina Maya Plisetskaya would join in on the fun, suggesting that the feeling of lightness she experienced dancing at the Bolshoi must have been similar to that felt by Alexei Leonov, the first man to complete a spacewalk in 1965. The now famous beeps of Sputnik launched the sonic space race. Lacking visual confirmation of the satellite, Soviet newspapers encouraged ordinary citizens to listen for the beeps on the radio in order to experience the historic orbit. And notably, the strains of Alexander Scriabin's poem of Ecstasy from 1908 echoed through homes in Red Square upon Gagarin's safe return to Moscow. Experiencing the space race at home was largely made possible by increased availability of consumer goods in the post-war period, which allowed many citizens access to radios and televisions. At the same time, material culture related to the space program spread throughout the Soviet Union and Eastern Bloc. Marble busts of Stalin ceded shelf space to plastic spaceships and trinkets like pins, posters, and stamps, which became commonplace in the average household. Although few Soviet citizens would get the chance to pilot their own spacecrafts, many could own a toy model and imagine space flight. Music boxes devoted to Sputnik's flight combined the sonic with the visual. One popular model pictured here that was produced in the late 1950s depicted Sputnik's flight above the globe with the date of its launch, October 4th, 1957, etched at its base. The mechanical wind-up player reproduced a series of the satellite's characteristic bleeps and a variation of the chorus to Wide is My Motherland, or Shiraka Strana Moya Rodnaya, a popular song from 1936 that had become a sort of unofficial anthem in the Soviet Union. The lyrics of the song, written by Vasily Lebedev-Kumach and set to music by Isaac Dunayevsky, reinforced the colonialist undertones of the space program. So let's listen. The music box thus performed important cultural work on two levels. First, implying a logical trajectory from land to space, its song selection transposed imagery of the vastness of the Soviet Union to the cosmos. Just as they had done decades earlier to Siberia, Central Asia, and East Central Europe, Soviets too could spread communism to outer space. And second, the music box turned the space race into a souvenir, by allowing men, women, and children to take home a piece of it in both image and sound. The trinket collectivized the experience of the space race, putting a Sputnik in every home. Gagarin and the other cosmonauts similarly repurposed music to give ordinary citizens an inroad to the space race. Music, he suggested in an interview with the newspaper Izvestia, was able to translate the physical and emotional sensations of space into a more earthly, approachable realm. When asked what his first feeling was upon landing, the cosmonaut demurred, "It is difficult to put into words the feelings that overwhelmed me when I stepped onto our Soviet ground. Above all, I was glad that the exercise had been successful. In general, the feeling I had experienced was one of joy. The moment I stepped out, I sang the song, 'The Motherland Hears, the Motherland Knows.'" Gagarin here was quoting Dmitry Shostakovich's choral work, "The Motherland Hears," or Rodina Slishit, the first of his four songs on text by Evgeny Dalmatovsky from 1951. The text, intended by Dalmatovsky to serve as an aeronautical beacon for pilots lost in a storm, was easily amended to fit the cosmonauts' triumph. Indeed, Gagarin was not the first to make the connection. The radio program Последние известия had combined the opening lines of Shostakovich's song with the interstellar beeps of Sputnik a few years earlier. But moments of modesty and transparency, like Gagarin's impromptu singing, helped to endear him to the public and to link him with a broader cultural memory. The cosmonaut hero sang the same tunes ordinary citizens had grown up singing. The motherland's people heard Gagarin, and he didn't sound all too different from them. The importance of this historical moment, however, demanded more than just pre-composed works. New horizons required new music. The soprano Larisa Alexandrovskaya, writing to Izvestia to commemorate Gagarin's flight, revealed the impossibility of conveying the moment through old means. "There is always a song in my heart. In it, I find light, and it soothes me and heightens my joy. But now I cannot find a song that would speak to such rapturous joy. There's a man in the cosmos, our Soviet man." Composers and lyricists would come to participate in the space program by putting pen to paper, writing music that would memorialize Gagarin's achievement and, additionally, energize and inspire the Soviet public. At this time in the 1960s, perhaps no genre of music was more popular than estrada. a loosely defined category, estrada were variety songs that were united more by their topicality than they were by musical style. As the musicologist David McFadden has shown, these songs were curated to the, quote, living word, such that they often dealt with contemporary social, political, and cultural themes. Accordingly, they were a powerful source of cultural and individual identity. Musical markers could include literary examples, parodies, folk music, dance, satire, and vocal group performances, just to name a few. A multi-stylistic genre, estrada were consumed by many people of many classes, genders, and ages. And notably, composers and performers often wrote and sang with such specific audiences in mind. Many performers believed that singing to and for an audience was the only way to ensure that viewers and listeners would be able to participate in the song and its subject material. It was at its heart a participatory genre, one that merged the subjectivities of composer, performer, and listener. And in this way, the genre reflected the changing cultural currents of the thaw perhaps better than any other. Many composers further formalized participatory sentiment through call and response techniques between a soloist and chorus, as in popular songs like To Distant Planets and Gagarin's March. Composed by Vano Muradelli with a text by Yevgeny Dalmatovsky, the song Cosmonauts, or Cosmonauti, emphasized the everyman status of the Soviet space explorer. Taken together, the three verses trace a path from the collective realization of reaching the heavens, the construction of a bridge to colonize the cosmos, and a reflection back on Earth's beauty. And I've put up the first verse in the chorus here. The chorus is a venerable who's who of proletarian society in the 1960s. The cosmonauts are joined by communists, komsomols, and pioneers. Rapidly delivered and punctuated by orchestral strikes, Muradelli's setting elides these four characters into one. The message to listeners and those singing along would have been clear. Bravery and valor were the purview of all Soviets, not just the cosmonauts. And so I'll play you just this bit so you can get a sense of the music.
О чуде, а больше мы любим творить чудеса. Сегодня штурмуют люди ракетами небеса. Космонавты, коммунисты, комсомольцы, миллионеры, наш путь неизведанный нам. Подвигом дерзким, от пионерским, каждым всегда.
Ordinary citizens too could set the cosmos to music. In an issue of the popular lifestyle magazine Ogonyok, correspondent Alexander Romanov published a poem called A Song About the Cosmonaut's Home, in which he and other reporters had written while working at the Cosmodrome in Baikonur. Pondering the cosmonauts' daily lives, Romanov explained he and his peers decided to pen a few verses about their potential day-to-day activities. He further detailed their version for how the song might sound: 2 soloists, 1 man, 1 woman for the verses, and a choral refrain of "From here they paved the way to the planets." The verses emphasized that this path had been laid out not just for the cosmonauts, but for all Soviet citizens. Focusing on their domestic rituals, the poem capitalized on the cosmonauts' popular reception and likenesses between them and average Soviets. It traced collective similarities, and in doing so, it implied that any ordinary citizen had heroic potential. 3 issues later, the magazine reported that several readers had taken Romanov's challenge to heart and had submitted musical settings of the text. The story of the song, editors explained, is somewhat unusual. In issue number 43 of our magazine, we published a note from A. Romanov titled A Song About the Cosmonaut's Home, in which the author described how he'd come to write the words of this future song. The day after the issue came out, the editor began to receive sheet music, melodies for the printed poem. And within a few days, we had already decided to hold a contest. The magazine named Boris Andreevich Makrosov the winner of this impromptu contest, and they published his setting alongside the lyrics. 2 issues later, Romanov wrote in once again to express his surprise and pleasure at the number of musical submissions. He described showing the winning song to cosmonauts German Titov and Valentina Tereshkova, writing that, quote, the cosmonauts asked the magazine Ogonyok to congratulate the composers who had entered on their joyful orbit in musical creativity, end quote. In doing so, Romanov demonstrated that the public's fandom of cosmic proportions was by no means lost on the cosmonauts. In return, readers and listeners gained a closeness to and insight into their cosmonaut idols. And yet, Makrosov, the spontaneous winner, was himself a well-known composer of popular songs. Nor was this sort of musical contest an unheard of event. Contests like these had been common occurrences since the 1930s. Much like Gagarin's deliberate curation disguised as authenticity, it is entirely possible that the contest was staged as part of a greater attempt at using music to cultivate an aura of participation around the space race. That Titov and Tereshkova publicly responded to Makrosov's victory demonstrates the extent to which editors and bureaucrats were willing to go in order to present the cosmonauts as accessible heroes of the everyday, be it through authentic or imagined conduits. In the changing currents of the thought, moments like this allowed ordinary citizens to participate in large-scale national projects. Rather than promote mere idolization or emulation of heroic figures, as had generally been practiced in the Stalinist period, music helped to pave a path for the co-creation of Soviet identity. The new Soviet man was no longer a concept that originated exclusively within state organs. Instead, the identity politics of Sovietness after Stalin were much more diffuse. They allowed for bottom-up individual negotiations that went hand in hand with a changing media and cultural landscape, one where participation and entertainment were as potent a means of cultural engineering as propaganda posters and public service announcements. Just as new ideas of Sovietness highlighted the differences between Gagarin and Tereshkova, so too did the music written for and about them. Alongside diverging gender standards in the home and workplace, composers' treatments of the 2 cosmonauts musically confirmed their diverging roles in the Soviet space program, and perhaps more importantly, its public reception. Now, that the 2 received different musical styles is not altogether surprising, nor is it unique to the Soviet context. What is notable, however, is how dramatically her musical settings departed from past models of musical citizenship. Although her music was still intended for the masses, the way it was delivered through intimate performance, not boisterous military marches, marked a significant departure from the Stalin-era socialist realist practices. It was music for the Khrushchev age, music that allowed for a semi-private and personal identification with its texts and sounds. And so even more than Gagarin's, Tereshkova's music disclosed the process of de-Stalinization through sound. If popular song was the ideal material for promoting the new Soviet man and woman in the space age, then television was the ideal conduit through which to do so. Goluboy Ogonyok, a popular variety show geared toward holidays, merged celebrities, musicians, and ordinary citizens through its casual atmosphere and easygoing setting. The episode from my opening anecdote, subtitled Star Relay, featured various performers and examples of estrada in honor of their special aeronautical guests. Musical numbers were interspersed with speeches, poems, and gender-appropriate gifts for Tereshkova. The style and intended audiences of the musical program offered great variety and breadth. There were songs for children, men, and women that covered civic, pastoral, romantic, and humorous themes. The cosmonauts were encouraged to sing along with performers, especially with the well-known song May There Always Be Sunshine, Pust Всегда будет солнце, although Tereshkova was oftentimes the only one to join in. Though paying special attention to Gagarin and Tereshkova, the camera interspersed shots of classically Russian audience members, girls with long braids, stoic men, elderly women in traditional plati or headscarves. The message was clear. Everyone could sing with the cosmonauts. I want to focus on the final two songs of this episode, which reinforced the image of space as a shared experience, while also presenting the cosmos as a colonized, domesticated arena. In Stars in the Conductor's Bag, composer Andrei Petrov and lyricist Lev Kuklin depict space as a respite from terrestrial problems, and more specifically as a feminine escape. Melancholy, meandering verses depict a tram conductor's banal life. Staring out the window onto the rainy streets, she rides in the back of a tram and dreams of distant galaxies. In the chorus, however, she enters a suspended state in which she, flying above the earth, calls for a beloved whom she cannot find. In the episode, Edita Piecha performs the song in a casual, sincere staging. Piecha's multinational upbringing, she was born to a Polish family in northern France, but grew up in Boguszów, Poland, as well as her sentimental vocal styling, embodied increasingly global and personal values in the post-Stalin era. Accordingly, her inclusion in the episode falls at the crossroads of two Khrushchev-era cultural developments. First, her multi-ethnic background reaffirmed the internationalist goals of the Soviet space program. And second, it imbued the performance with a thaw-era cosmopolitanism, especially given her slight yet discernible Polish accent. Her staging strategies too reinforce this. While she begins sitting down and singing directly to the cosmonauts, she ends the number by walking into an open area and looking into the camera to all those watching at home. By expanding her frame of reference from just Tereshkova and Gagarin to the entire Soviet people, Piecha indicates that her performance, while dedicated for the cosmonauts, is for everyone to consume. And I'll play just the beginning of this performance.
Я кондуктор трамвая, мне город знаком. Все считают работу мою пустяком. Я зимою и летом отрываю билеты и мечтаю в вечернем вагоне пустом. Я лечу, 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 лечу над землей и шепчу, 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 милый мой, где же ты, когда ты войдешь в мой вагон? Нас далекой звездою зовет небосклон, и все круче, круче, круче.
The episode's final number, Cosmic Couplets, or Kosmichesky Chastechki, is a folk-style satirical song performed by the comedians Alexander Shurov and Nikolai Rikunin. Appearing frequently as guests on the show, their rapport and delivery resembled the comedy duo of Abbott and Costello. Accompanying themselves on the accordion, the two trade couplets in alternatingly sincere and sarcastic ways, which was a deadpan style characteristic of Chastechki. Saturated with inside jokes and clever puns, the text pokes fun at the cosmonauts, state bureaucracy, the United States, and Tereshkova and Gagarin themselves, all while the audience and guests double over with laughter. And I'll play this. The lyrics in the bit that I'm going to play are basically, they used to protect the cosmonauts from orbit, from rays when in orbit, but now they need to protect them from banquets and speeches, they meaning the state. We don't think that this cosmic path will be scary for our wives. Their work at home has prepared them for this kind of burden, and so on. So let's watch.
Космонавтов на орбите защитили от лучей.
Весь вопрос сейчас в защите от банкетов и речей.
Мы считаем, женам нашим путь космический не страшен.
Их домашние нагрузки приучили к перегрузке.
This was television for both the space age and the thaw, television that embraced its status as a form both of entertainment and cultural education. Not only could you sing with the cosmonauts, but you could also laugh with them. And perhaps more importantly to Soviet culture after Stalin, you could laugh at them too. As a major part of everyday life, these songs helped to reshape Soviet identity after Stalin and propel the nation forward into an uncertain cosmic era. Gagarin and Tereshkova symbolized new Soviet heroes, ones who smiled, sang, and laughed at each other, who simultaneously demonstrated the potential of socialism without reinscribing unattainable ideals of citizenry. For the millions of Soviet citizens with access to radio and television, these songs allowed ordinary people to participate in this new Soviet future. Space was not just for the cosmonauts. It was for the communists, the komsomols, the pioneers, the everyman and every woman who watched their country's successes in space and, even if only for a moment, dreamt of something greater than him or herself. Yet Soviet primacy in the space race would not last the decade. Although Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong would not walk on the moon until 1969, the Soviet space program waned dramatically in the second half of the 60s after a series of failures and tragedies. Perhaps the most powerful blow to the space program's domestic image was Gagarin's death in a routine test flight in 1968. Mournful headlines remembered the cosmonaut as a pioneer of the cosmic path, a son of the earth, and a symbol of the age of communism. To the tumult of 1968, then, we can add another event in the decline of the thaw and Khrushchev-era utopianism. And the very same composers who years earlier had celebrated Gagarin's orbit would turn to memorializing his loss. As Soviet politics slowly began to chill once more, citizens mourned not only the death of Gagarin, but also the decline of the utopian ideals of the cosmos and the promises of the thaw, the gilded future that was to become a second home for socialism and the social progress that would bring them there. Indeed, just a few years after Gagarin's death, Andrei Tarkovsky's film Solaris from 1972 would depict space as a very different sort of escape, as an emotional vacuum in which the immensity of human psychology and inner struggle painted the cosmos in dystopian shades. The space program's success narrative was slowly but surely decaying, due in no small part to the cultural agents and media that had cultivated it in the first place. And with it, the promises of the thaw gave way to Leonid Brezhnev's more realistic, actually existing socialism. As is almost always the case, lost utopias still make for powerful sources of creative inspiration. Rather than point forward into the future, later musical depictions of space would be laced with nostalgia, or perhaps more accurately, disillusionment. In 1983, the rock group Zemlyanya, or Earthlings, participated in the Song of the Year, Pesnya Goda contest, an annual music competition hosted by Central Television. The group wowed audiences with their synth-driven rock, feedback-filled guitar solos, and driving bass line. Counting both a double-necked guitar and a gleaming black keytar among their instruments, the ensemble looked, felt, and sounded like the Soviet 1980s, an exciting, messy blend of kitsch and sincerity, sanctioned and non-conformist, Soviet and global. Clad in suits and wearing their hair tousled and long, Zemlyanya performed Grass by the Home, Trava u doma, to captivated viewers and listeners. Sung from the perspective of an unnamed cosmonaut, the song speaks to the loneliness of space and the dissolution of family ties by distance and technology. Despite his brave deeds, the song's protagonist fixates on loss and missing his mother while so far from home. His heroism is simply a means to an end, a footnote to a far more poignant emotional journey. This was not unlike the space program itself. What had given rise to countless hopes and dreams in the early 1960s had become a banal reminder of past successes and present problems in the 70s and 80s.
И снится нам не рокот космодрома, не эта ледяная синева, а снится нам трава, трава у дома, зеленая, зеленая трава.
Space, in the end, was not even for the cosmonauts, let alone the communists, komsomols, or pioneers. Or rather, it had been at first, but like so much else in the Soviet socialist project, it proved to be fickle, just out of reach, and brighter in ideals than reality. Much like Khrushchev's thaw gradually gave way to Brezhnev-era pragmatism, the utopian underpinnings of the Soviet space program receded into collective memory. Music that had once cultivated a post-Stalin Soviet citizenry came to embody its disappearance. Performed, enacted through everyday action, and broadcast through various media, the same processes of identity formation that had proved so potent at the outset of the space race contributed to its demise. The cosmonaut Everyman, in the end, was eclipsed by the Soviet everyday. Thank you. I'm going to stop my share.
So, thank you very much for this brilliant lecture and really interesting material. And I think we have really a lot of some thoughts and questions to discuss. And if you don't mind, Boris Stepanov will start the discussion. So I'll join the discussion. And now and after we can open.
We begin with the brief questions?
Brief questions. Okay. So if anyone has something to ask Gabrielle and to probably to specify something, you can raise a hand or you can write your question in the chat and we can read it. Or if not, we can start. Because I really I do not see anyone who who has something to ask. So probably we'll start.
Of course we can maybe maybe somebody ask question later. So I have a brief comments and maybe I'll begin with the demonstration of my short presentation because I have some texts which I want to show while I will commenting Gabrielle's talk. So I'll begin, and I want to say that I think that Gabrielle's paper, which I've read, and today's talk shows well the role of popular songs in shaping cosmic enthusiasm. And in general shows how the musical culture reproduces the character of Soviet astroculture. Particularly, I'd like to mention her consideration of the questions, for example, such questions, how music was embedded in new media contexts like Голубой огонек and some other forms, some other translations of early Soviet television, and how cosmonauts acted as new stars of this democratic early television in Russia and in Soviet in Thaw period, and how they promoted such musical genres as couplets and sang couplets, частушки, куплеты и частушки. However, it seems to me that the characterization of the cultural significance of musical works related to the space flights can be sufficiently complemented by work with musical material, by more detailed work with musical material. And I have some comments on this topic. I have some comments concerning the plot related to the electronic music. It is presented quite well in the article of Konstantin Kaminsky, and as Gabrielle told, she also has some ideas. Maybe she can share them with us. But I'll focus on popular songs. In article, we have a list of the songs which concern the Soviet space crusade. It seems to me that this list is somewhat incomplete and have some inexactness. Let me give you an example. For example, the list includes the songs which name Звездный вальс, Starry Waltz by Andrei Babayev. Andrei Babayev was a rather well-known Soviet composer who writes songs, for example, for such a famous singer of this time as Rashid Beybutov. But as for me, the text of the songs, which you can see on the slide, has obvious connection with the space flight. But we have meanwhile the two other songs with the same name, which are directly related to space, to the topic. And you can see them, the first of them on this slide, and this is such a bravura song, and it's dedicated to one of the heroines of the article, to Valentina Tereshkova, and her call sign, Chaika, the seagull, is actively played as in the text of this song, as in the other songs dedicated to the first woman cosmonaut. The second song you can see on the next slide is more radical and combines the images of Soviet love songs, «Друг мой верный, слышу голос твой», «My faithful friend, I hear your voice», with new cosmic decorations. By the way, if we talk about the image of common man as astronaut, I think that it was absolutely impossible to bypass another work of the friend of cosmonauts, which Gabrielle mentioned in her text, Oscar Feldsman, who was the author of the song «Мой Вася». «Мой Вася», and here you can see it, and the this song comes out on the topic of the space flights as if from within is popular and entertaining music. The lyrical heroine of the song believes that her lover is capable of anything, including the space flight. The list of the song, which we find in the text, as to me, can not only be replenished with other works related to the space theme, but also interpreted in a more detailed way, building a typology of songs for one reason or another. Here, one could also look on how image of the space flights are built, how this corpus of songs reflects changes in music and poetic styles and so on. Maybe Gabrielle could share some thoughts on this topic. Another interesting question concerned the connection between the pop songs and unfolding the space race, which was very important for the fate of musical and cinematic works about space flights. This question is very well illustrated by the story of the creation of the famous song «Я верю, друзья», I believe friends, which was described in the memoirs of its author, Vladimir Voinovich. The song was prepared for the flight of the first astronaut and was written in 1960, not in 1961. The song gained popularity among listeners, but didn't receive official recognition. Voinovich described that the editors tried to remove some earthiness, some приземленность and unkeptness from the text. And for example, they particularly didn't like the image of пыльные тропинки. They tried to remove it from the text. However, official recognition came to the song in 1962, and on the slide you can see the description of this process. So Voinovich described it, and the flight of Popovich and Nikolaev gave this song a new life. And so the end of the dialogue between Voinovich and the editor is, you can see, of course, Voinovich here is already humorously acting of the nagging of the centers. And then this song, the song will become the title song in one of the main films of the period, Dream Towards, мечте навстречу. And in the end of my talk, I'll show the small shirt of, sorry, small sorry.
It's a good thing the people who designed Zoom didn't also design the software to get us to the cosmos.
Yes. Here you are. I hope you see the.
Вы все помните тот августовский день 1962 года, когда два сына Земли подняли к звездам ее песню.
Я верю, друзья, караваны ракет помчат нас вперед от звезды до звезды. На пыльных тропинках далеких планет останутся наши следы.
И песня эта, как радиомаяк, повела вас за собой, юные мечтатели и романтики. Вам и посвящается этот фантастический фильм.
So and and here you can see the next song, which which is which going through the film, Я земля, which was created by Vano Muradeli, and also the famous song on the space flights. So I think that this topic, the topic we're discussing today, has a great potential, and it has a great potential for the future studies. And I think that Gabrielle can bring us some interesting discoveries and findings. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I also have a few questions regarding something you mentioned in your lecture and in the text in your paper, and probably, yeah, I have really only questions and only short comments. So first of all, probably it's necessary, it's really better to start with some questions regarding the research methods and theoretical framework, since you use several terms and several concepts. First, it is a term, and it is also a question: is it a term? Participatory practices. Could you please clarify what you mean in this case, and how these practices were studied, and how this and what were the sources to study these practices? Since you mentioned some song singing, some performative element of this song singing, but how can we study these exact practices? How can we call them participatory rather than genre-specific practices, or practices related to the musical genre, or as, for example, also rather common element in Soviet mass song, in Soviet some mass concerts and mass performances, I mean. So it's kind of genre, as it seems to me, more than something else. So this second question, it is also very related to the first question, the formation of identities. You mentioned that this new ideology of new Soviet Soviet persona, it was supported by different participatory practices, different ways of making these identities, making these personal identities and relations to these, not to this ideology, but to the images of this new Soviet persona. So my question is also, how can we study these ways of identification, this formation of identities? How can we characterize the practices of singing songs and buying some kind of souvenirs as indicative of the formation of these identities of new Soviet Soviet person, and not as a part of cultural policy of the USSR? So how can we distinguish these two parts of this cultural policy, the representation of this ideology and formation of personal identities relating to this new ideology? And I also have some several questions regarding some facts, and yeah, actually 3 questions. First, as you mentioned, Zemlyane songs, The Grass at Home, as an example of dispelled illusion about a cosmic utopia. First of all, it seems to me important to know that along with Zemlyane band, there were many other popular Soviet rock bands that continued to glorify space and cosmic utopia, on the contrary, developing these ideas. For example, and you definitely know this band, the Zodiac band from Latvia, if I'm not mistaken. The band really popular, very incredibly popular in the USSR, which released in 1982 the album Music in the Universe. In 1983, almost 2 million copies of this album were sold. So this is the first question: how can we also distinguish the image of this disillusion represented by Zemlyane with compared to other images created and represented by other rock bands like Zodiac, really popular in the USSR, that continued this cosmic utopia. Secondly, the lyrics of Zemlyane concerned were really focused on romance, male professions like pilots, athletes, astronauts, stuntmen, and a lot of, all these examples. Compared to many contemporaries, Zemlyane were distinguished by heavy music, energetic presentation of material, expressive behavior on stage and stage presence, and so on. I want to say that all these elements of Zemlyane's performance and their lyrics seems to me more also related to the genre of rock music and something romantic, sentimental, and emotional, and nostalgic. Also, all these topics are the parts of rock music and British first of all rock music that were the main, not the idols, but the main musical genre and musical examples that became like the base for the Zemlyane and other bands like them. So they are oriented on this music, really extremely oriented. And one more question, because it's really interesting. How the sound of space was represented in music, since you mentioned lyrics and some live performances singing, but how we can catch and represent space in the music, especially before space rock and electronic music in the 80s. Yeah. And also we have several questions in the chat, but probably you should start with answers on our comments and
No, that's great. You've given me so much to think about. Thank you so much, Boris and Alexandra, and to everyone for listening. Yeah, I mean, both Boris and Alexandra have touched on sort of one of the challenges of this project, which is that it's kind of like, dare I say, matryoshki, where you can just, it keeps going and it keeps going, and there are all of these different genres and styles. So like that list, the table that Boris referred to in the print article version, it's in no way comprehensive, because and two, right, Boris has brought to attention a few really great examples of songs that are explicitly linked to space. But there are plenty that were not explicitly linked to space, but became linked to space through context-based performances. And this spanned many genres, right? So again, like my talk today focuses on popular music, but people were writing ballets and operas about this. One of the composers who I feature most, who I research most often, Alfred Schnittke, he wrote a piece called Poema o Kosmosie, a poem about space, where he's using electronic musical instruments in 1960. That is eventually sort of panned by the censors and never gets a performance. So this really is just truly a wide-reaching, I should say, cultural idea that's manifesting in musical genres across the board. And it's not just in the Soviet Union either, right? the United States, we had lots of popular musicians who were responding to Soviet successes in space. Some of my favorites, there's a song called Sputniks and Mutniks, which was written in response to the launch of both Sputnik 1 and then also Bielka and Strelka on Sputnik 2. I should note too that my dog Laika is certainly, she's now getting, perked up. I think she knows that it's her time to shine. She was promised a co-panelist slot for this talk. So things like, you know, Satellite Baby, where Roosevelt Sykes is saying something like, my girlfriend, she's so hot, Mr. Khrushchev, she's faster than Sputnik #1, things like that. So again, this is a massive project, and I would love to do something if folks are looking for extra work, because I'm sure that we all have plenty of endless free time, but I would love to sort of create some sort of compilation or database of all of these sorts of things. I mean, within the Soviet Union or abroad. So Poland, for example, the girl group Filipinki has this very famous number called Vala Twist, or Valentina Twist, that then I think it's either Edita Piecha or Lydia Clement who performed this in Russian translation on Goluboya Ogonyok in 1964, I think. So again, there are all of these really fascinating networks that are coming around this cultural idea of space. And I think that too kind of links, that comes back to these two sort of theoretical questions that Alexandra has asked, sort of how am I defining participatory practices or sort of performative practices, but then also how can we study ways of identification, like the new Soviet man, versus just the sort of cultural policy of the USSR. And this is, of course, every historian's challenge, right? Because we can go to the archives and see what the state said, but we know that archives are inherently incomplete and curated themselves. We can look at letters that people wrote into newspapers, especially in the 50s and 60s, when you had this kind of citizen journalism arise, where people are writing lots of letters to newspapers, жалобы, complaints to Central Committee and Ministry of Culture. But all of these too are kind of performative, right? It's not, this is me being like a nihilistic postmodernist where I'm just like, it's all just performative all the way down. But I think that one of the things that really drew me to this project, and one of the things that, as someone who was born pretty much after the Soviet Union collapsed, this is something that still sticks with me, is that the space race and the launch of Gagarin especially was this rare moment, I think, in Soviet history where both the utopian cultural policy ideas of the state aligned with the real lived excitement and experiences of ordinary Soviets on the ground. Laika is playing with her toys now. She was so good for the entire, I'm just gonna have to let that one go. This is like occupational. Yes, Laika, I know. Come here, come here, come here, Laika. Sit. Good girl. Okay, stay there. She would not make it into space. She's not well behaved enough. Although probably a good thing, because it didn't end well for the first Laika. So I think that we can sort of, this is one of those rare moments where official policy and lived experience kind of aligned, more or less, at least in the immediate. Laika, come on. I'm sorry. Yes, these are the sounds of my Mutnik. This is a new conference presentation experience for me. Like, I'm gonna lock you outside on the balcony if you don't stop. So I think that we can sort of read these against each other productively and see where sort of official policy and lived experience and lived response align and diverge. And this is one of those moments where they tend to align. And in terms of performance or sort of participatory politics, I'm thinking here, I'm drawing on work by performance studies scholars like Judith Butler, of course, sort of being the original but then also Diana Taylor, Peggy Phelan, Philip Auslander, and this idea of sort of the performative politics of cultural memory. This is something where when you bring these cultural artifacts in this historic moment into the home on television, right, where people can sing along with the TV, and especially I think the staging of something like Goluboy Ogonyok is really really important here, because it's set in a cafe-like setting, and the camera takes special care to pan to audience members who are sitting much like you could be sitting at home watching this. So that's the sort of performance or sort of participatory politics of the space race that I'm talking about, this sort of idea that through embodied sensorial forms of cultural or embodied cultural production, you can identify more closely with that sort of that product, right, that cultural work. Yeah, I mean, then there are these questions about, right, what are the sounds of space? And this is something, of course, I mean, if we were to get quite literal, there is no sound in space, right? I mean, what's the tagline for the famous, is it Alien, the horror film? In space, no one can hear you scream. There is no sound in space, right? So this is a question that composers, before we ever made it out of the atmosphere, were grappling with. Scriabin, of course, perhaps most famously with this sort of mysticist symbolist drive, but even earlier, I mean, classical composers like Joseph Haydn were writing about sort of drawing on astrological sciences at the end of the 18th century to try to write about space. But I do think, right, at the mid-century point, with movies like Forbidden Planet, or in the Soviet Union, Planeta Bur, right, Planet of the Storms. You've got, within the Soviet context, composers drawing on the theremin, right, the first sort of, what was hailed at least as the first electronic instrument, and of course is otherworldly in the sense that you don't have to touch anything to play it. You also saw by the middle of the century the proliferation of synthesizers like the Ekvadin, the Emeriton, and sort of these ensembles that are dedicated to the production of electronic musical instruments. And the Ministry of Culture very explicitly supports this. There are calls for sort of the mass mobilization of industry to produce electronic musical instruments. And the idea very much was, how do we sound like the country that gave the world Sputnik? There is this deliberate equivocation, such that the Ekvadin synthesizer goes with the Soviet exhibit to the Brussels World Fair in 1958. And as Sputnik hangs overhead above the spectators, people are listening to the sounds of the Ekvadin and writing in these guest books, these comment books, you know, this is exactly what I would expect the Soviet Union to sound like. Thank you for giving us Gagarin. Thank you for giving us Sputnik, not Gagarin, because this is 58, and so on. So I do think there is this very deliberate attempt by the Ministry of Culture, especially, to capitalize on that. The Composers Union doesn't really get in on that until it's a little bit later, frankly. And we could sort of trace the history of Soviet electronic music as one that was in many ways stunted by a lack of communication across institutions within the Soviet bureaucracy, I think. But then, of course, you know, with Saliaris, you've got Artemiev with the Ants synthesizer composing this score. So I think for many, the sound of music are these ethereal, nebulous electronic sounds. But those weren't necessarily the sounds that people could sing along with. You could sing along with the Ants synthesizer, but it wouldn't sound very good necessarily. So I hope that answers your question somewhat. I'm distracted by the house that is next to me.
Thank you very much for the answers. And we also have several questions from the chat. I can read it, or as you wish.
Sure, it looks like Ryers has the first question.
Yeah.
So the question is, what impact did this idea of the cosmonaut everyman have on the other nationalist tendencies in the other Soviet republics? Specifically, how did this impact relations between Soviet Russia and the republics of Armenia and Ukraine? surely after the fact, this had some sort of impact or effect. I'm not an expert in either of those countries, so I couldn't tell you for sure, but I do know that at the time when these things are happening, there's very much this notion that these are not Russian achievements, but rather Soviet achievements, which of course is a fraught concept when you're an ethnic Armenian who's being told that you should only speak and communicate in Russian, right? And I think of some of the burgeoning nationalist movements that are taking place under Khrushchev, right? This sort of loosening of these restrictions that you had under Stalin in terms of policy in the republics. But this was very much presented as a Soviet success, and even more importantly, a socialist success, right? This is at the core of the space project. Is we've got these two competing ideological systems, Western capitalism and Soviet socialism. And the goal with the space project, well, one of many goals, was to show the supremacy of a centralized approach to these sorts of technological achievements through the state. And so it wasn't ethnically Russian, it was Soviet, but even more so, it was socialist. And so I think this is why countries like Poland, for example, are reacting in the same way, where it's sort of, this is a triumph of socialism. So I don't think that at the time, frankly, there was much, and it was such a wonderful utopian moment that many people across the Soviet Union, be they ethnically Russian, Bashkir, Armenian, Ukrainian, rallied around this. This was, I mean, it was a triumph globally. This is the sort of thing where young kids in the United States were listening to the beeps of Sputnik and looking overhead, trying to spot the satellite and imagining what could happen. So I think that this was kind of this global success, but of course presented through this socialist lens.
Yeah, there are several questions more in the chat regarding traditional music. Were any attempts to bring traditional music into the cosmos? Very interesting question. So do you know any examples or anything that you find in different sources?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. Thank you, Austin and Maritza. Yeah, I mean, there were orchestrations that featured folk instruments like balalaika, domra, accordion, of course, right? I try to think of the genre. I don't even know if we would call it a genre or more a lifestyle, I don't know, but of the chastushki, that existed before the space race. It exists today. I mean, I think you can still watch, I think Goluboy Ogonyok still does like a New Year's special or something. And you can still see these sorts of chastushki performed on traditional accordions. So there were orchestrations that were sort of playing upon these traditional or these folk sound worlds, these folk timbres with these folk instruments. And I think those two tended to correlate really heavily with this idea of the cosmos is not just a place to explore, but it's a place that we could conceivably call home. And so it is sort of, I think, embedded in that idea of, well, how can we transplant Soviet socialist culture to space or the moon or wherever, right? So I think that those folk instruments are doing a lot of important cultural work with songs like that. Siobhan has asked, I'm interested to hear your opinions about Soviet space accomplishment marketing in modern day Russia. Oh, so Siobhan, you're trying to get me banned from getting another visa. Well, I am actually drinking coffee from a mug that I got from the Museum of Cosmonautics.
This is my coaster right here.
I mean, I think
about the collectivizing the experience of the space race, but it still really seems to exist today.
I think it does. And I mean, for example, it was funny, Oksana started the talk by saying "Поехали," which of course is Gagarin's famous phrase that he said at the beginning of his launch. And it's a phrase that's been sampled, at least within Russian music, I think it's safe to say, more than any other phrase. Soviet techno with groups like Novyi Kompozitori at the end of the Soviet Union in the late 1980s, early 1990s. They're sampling "Поехали," they're having Gagarin raves in Leningrad. Their most famous track, I think, and I interviewed one of the members when I was in Russia, is Sputnik of Life. which is this fantastic. Maybe I'll post it in the Facebook group for all who are interested. But yeah, this is still very much present. I kind of, I joke with students sometimes. If you're from the United States and you go to Russia, there are two questions that you need to be prepared to answer. Number one is, who won World War II? The answer is not the United States, right? And number two, who got to space first, right? These are still very important cultural touchstones within Russian and post-Soviet identity more broadly. But again, they enjoy this fascination and love across the world. I think so many people remember, if they're old enough. My mom was on this chat, so I won't single her out because she's certainly not old enough to remember Gagarin. But a lot of people remember these global triumphs in space. And so I do think it still is very, very prevalent in sort of a global collective memory, but it is sort of key too when I'm thinking about, Russia today under Putin and this sort of, how can we reclaim this status as a global superpower that we lost with the fall of the Soviet Union. I think that something like the space race is a really important touchstone in that revitalization project.
Yeah, Gabrielle, you probably know this YouTube channel, Soviet New Wave. Yeah, it was launched in 2008, 17 or 18. I'm not sure, quite sure. So just really few years ago, and there are a lot of playlists with different Soviet space music, not only space rock, but something inspired by space or sounds of space and so on, and contemporary music as well. Really a lot of contemporary Russian and Ukrainian and Belarusian and yeah, mostly Ukrainian, Russian, and Belarusian musicians represented on that channel. Like, for example, Ukrainian rock, not rock, but it's like synth rock, synth pop band called Mayak, with these Soviet space movies and Soviet space music inspired songs, and so on. With sounds of the universe and so on and so on, and really a lot of musicians, young musicians who perform on really fancy Moscow clubs like Mutabor or Pluton. Before it was closed just a few years ago. They not try to continue this tradition, but they really had a lot of links to this space music from the Soviet time, and it was like really space music from the Soviet time, not something specific, just common representation of this sound and this spirit of space, Soviet music and so on. So this is, this is really popular, and there are a lot of different online platforms, or some festivals or some concerts related to Gagarin, as you
Yuri's Night was just Saturday. This is a global festival and celebration of Cosmonautics Day. Yeah, and of course, there's this infrastructure that was constructed with the space program, right? Be it factories for creating parts, or the sorts of conduits through which you could disseminate this information. I'm reminded of this because Pluton, where I spent many a late night when I was living in Moscow, I'm pretty sure is in an abandoned or repurposed factory, right? So you still have that sort of industrial aesthetic. I think it's Pluton. But I think a fascinating example is so Vladimir Kuzmin, who created the Polyvox synthesizer in Yekaterinburg, he was working at a military factory that had been basically repurposed after the Soviets withdrew from Afghanistan, and they had all of these parts, vacuum tubes, electronics, circuits, etc., that you could then use to create synthesizers. So there is this sort of ebb and flow, especially between electronic music and the sort of technological apparatuses that you need to create a space program or a sort of massive military industrial program. Yeah, check out that YouTube channel too. Truly, I mean, from a research standpoint, the fandom of Russians today when it comes to the Soviet space program or Soviet technological programs is so helpful as a historian because they post, you know, like Ogonyok is entirely digitized. As much as I love going to Leninka and requesting all of the issues of Ogonyok and getting weird looks from the librarian women because they're like, oh, this foreigner's at it again. I can just go to a webpage and it's all there. And it's this sort of decentralized guerrilla memorialization and archivization project. So I'm grateful for the many Reddit forums and LiveJournal sites that have compiled a lot of these materials.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there is one more comment, but it's rather difficult to answer the question.
Hi, Evgenia. Not a question, but more a thought. I wonder whether contemporary achievements in space exploration are reflected in music somehow, especially modern day China. It would be logical for the Chinese sort of cultural apparatuses to promote the topic of space and building national identity and to incorporate it into the arts. I apologize. I have no idea. I think that's a really fascinating question. My linguistic abilities kind of maxed out at Russian and Polish. I was like, that's enough struggle for me. So I have no idea if anybody knows of this, but I do think that assumption is probably true. I think it's a safe assumption to make. So I don't know if like space is coming up in C-pop tracks, but I wouldn't be surprised if within sort of state cultural apparatuses, it's showing up. TikTok, oh yeah. Allianz had a bit of a renaissance on TikTok a while back.
Is there something someone want to ask Gabrielle about something or not? Yeah, I think. Okay. So probably we can conclude and finish our. Yeah. So I'm just trying to follow the chat and not missing anything from there. Okay. Gabrielle, really thank you very much for this topic, for the lecture, and for really interesting examples. And the scale, of the topic is very thought-provoking, first of all, and it's really
inspiring.
Yeah. Dare I say there's an entire galaxy of research potential.
Yeah. That's exactly what I'm thinking about. Because when I read your paper, I was thinking that there are like 3 topics. You touch minimum 3 topics in the paper, and it was also in your today's presentation. It was really interesting to follow all these topics, but it's really difficult and really inspiring to look at the really big problem of space and how space represented in culture. Firstly, how space represented and used in cultural policy in different countries in the USSR of different periods, first of all. So I hope it's our second meeting on this topic, and I hope it's not the last one, and we will continue this tradition to meet every year 11 and 12, sorry, not 11, 12, and to continue this conversation and this discussion every 5
Perfect. Днем Cosmonautики. Всем большое спасибо. Я очень благодарна. So, thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for this presentation. Thank you.
Счастливого пути! Поехали!
regards to like.
Yes, like it's finally calmed down now that we're ending.
Of course. Now she fulfilled the mission.
Yeah,
Yes.
she was so good. She was just sleeping peacefully next to me. You know, Cosmonauti didn't wake her up. She perked up a little bit with Travau Doma. She was like, oh, what's that? That sounds like fun. And then just chaos. So.
Thank you very much. And everyone who spent their time joining with us. It was such a lovely journey to a space of dreams, aspirations. And I think it inspired a lot of new conquerors of the space, right?
If Leica keeps squeaking, I'm going to send her up in a spacecraft. Now that I live in Miami, I'm very close to Cape Canaveral, which is where a lot of NASA
I
missions
think
are.
you
So.
can go and watch the start, right? When you have time and there is no restriction, you can like travel and stay there and look how it goes.
Sneak Leica onto the spaceship.
And can you make a broadcast or like go live from there, or it is prohibited?
I think you can. Yeah. Should I ever get the chance, I'll put it on Facebook Live. You'll see it.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. And thank you everyone for your time and nice input to this lecture. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Пока-пока.
Пока-пока-пока.